del veto o de la llamada regla de unanimidad ha fracasado. Sus más celosos defensores lo saben, aun cuando no lo reconozcan. Todo el mundo sabe también que los 5 miembros permanentes están habitualmente en desacuerdo. A medida que avance el tiempo lo estarán cada vez más, aún en las cuestiones en que fácilmente pudieran concordar. No se ponen de acuerdo unas veces porque no pueden y otras porque no quieren. El privilegio les fue acordado para beneficio de la paz y de la seguridad del mundo y lo han usado al solo objeto de defender sus intereses nacionales. Han violado el artículo 24 de la Carta, que los obliga a actuar en nombre de los intereses de todos los Estados miembros y no solamente en el de sus propios intereses. Han violado la promesa recordada ayer desde esta tribuna que hicieron en San Francisco y lo han hecho hasta ahora en forma irritante. Las condiciones políticas han cambiado. Hoy día no son las mismas que predominaban en el mundo cuando se reunió la conferencia de San Francisco. La cláusula rebus sic stantibus está implícitamente contenida en todos los tratados. La organización
Want to live in security. Let us not be cynics and ridiculously pompous. Inside our skins, all we live in some possible Hiroshima. What then is our first task? To give support to the work for peace, for agreement and towards cooperation. If necessary, to enforce it if there should be a lack of willingness with some. To strengthen the authority of the United Nations in keeping with the principles proclaimed in the Charter and not give in an iota of this agreement signed by all these states to whom peace is priceless. To that the United Nations as such shall not be the deciding factor, but that the representatives of the nations who have severed themselves from the concept of unanimity shall decide. These efforts at dismantling the peace train are foreign to us because we still see, and we hope always to see in the Security Council, a magnificent instrument of peaceful endeavor and a guarantee that the road taken at San Francisco is not, will not, and cannot become forked. There is no sense for me to elaborate on the reasons why this pact is in conflict with the Charter. Those of you who know the substance of Article 51, 52, and 53, and you are familiar with them, know that this is so. That this pact is not particularly in accord with the Charter, we have already heard expressed in varying degrees of emphasis and in many different ways, with carefully chosen words from both the Honorable President of this Assembly, Dr. Herbert V. Everett, before the signing of the pact, and the sincere objections of the General Secretary, Mr. Trigwell. And finally, we have read the account of journalist George Barrett in the New York Times, writing that the majority of the members of the Secretariat of the United Nations are of the opinion that the Atlantic Pact is in contradiction to the spirit of the Charter. We are not even mentioning that the members of the Secretariat were said to have made the objection that Italy and Portugal are not members of the United Nations. All of these gentlemen are without question specialists in matters pertaining to the United Nations. Finally, you have read the note of the Soviet Union. It is clear and comprehensive. I do not intend to repeat what has been said here and what is already familiar to all.
Mr. President, I should like, of course, to join at some points with some of the observations offered by the last speaker, Dr. Hoffmeister of the Czechoslovakian delegation. Some of his subject matter surprised me, but I think in fairness that I ought to say that apparently it was offered with a little more moderation, if with no more relevancy, than the argument submitted yesterday by the leader of the Soviet Russian delegation. My delegation, of course, was surprised that Mr. Gromyko chose to introduce in violent and aggressive fashion such irrelevancies to this debate. He, of course, ran away from the issue which is before the Assembly. He slandered my government. He traduced the intentions of every signatory to the Atlantic Pact. And apologetic as I am for having therefore to be as irrelevant as he was, I imagine that the Assembly would scarcely expect me to do otherwise than attempt some kind of reply. Sir, I may be permitted to remind the Assembly that last Saturday in the Political Committee I made a very brief statement in which I pleaded, I hope not impertinently nor discourteously, with Mr. Gromyko to conduct his case in a business-like fashion. I did then say that if we were going to be subject to propaganda attack, then of course my delegation would take methods to reply. This is the second attack we've had. We've now listened to a third. We've now seen a list of speakers. And I imagine we're going to hear a fourth and a fifth and a sixth. I want to suggest to Mr. Gromyko and to those gentlemen who quite properly associate themselves with his case that if he thinks his argument is well-founded, if as a member of the United Nations he has complaint to make about the Atlantic Pact and its relation to the Charter, I imagine his course is quite plain, and I would never attempt to teach Mr. Gromyko anything about procedure. They can find redress within the instruments of the United Nations. They can find a place for the subject on the agenda of the United Nations. But I, for one, don't expect that straightforward and orderly procedure. I expect that whenever the Soviet government finds itself in an illogical position or in a politically tight corner within the proceedings of this Assembly or its committees, we shall meet with a fresh outburst, or perhaps fresh is the wrong word, or rather stale outburst upon the proceedings which we now call the Atlantic Pact. Indeed, their tactic has been laid down for them in the official Soviet history of diplomacy, published in 1945. Perhaps I might be permitted to quote. To the same group of examples of the concealment of predatory ends behind noble principles also belong the instances of the exploitation of the idea of disarmament and pacifist propaganda in the broad sense of the word for one's own purpose. The directing phrase is, of course, the last one, for one's own purpose.